Dylan whispered the words that would haunt me for the next 6 months. Just keep pretending. But when the world found out our engagement was a lie, I realized Dylan wasn't the villain of my story. He was the only one willing to burn his own life down to save mine. The chandelier light shattered against the champagne flutes like tiny diamonds, but I couldn't feel the sparkle. I felt the sweat pooling between my shoulder blades, a cold contrast to the stifling heat of the ballroom. I was standing in a room full of people who wanted my head on a platter, vultures in silk and sequins, and the only thing keeping me upright was the heavy, warm arm wrapped around my waist. Dylan leaned in, his lips brushing against the sensitive shell of my ear. He smelled like expensive cologne, wood smoke, and the kind of power that didn't need to raise its voice. "Smile, Abigail," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that made my skin tingle and my heart skip a jagged beat. "Just keep pretending. If they see you tremble, we're both dead." I forced my lips into a jagged smile, a mask I had perfected over the last 3 weeks. I looked at the man standing in front of us, Victor, who was currently swirling a glass of scotch with a predatory glint in his eye. Victor was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who had been trying to dig up dirt on my family's struggling estate for months, looking for any crack in the foundation to bring us down. If he found out that my sudden engagement to Dylan, the city's most eligible, mysterious, and feared billionaire, was nothing more than a desperate business contract, my father would lose everything by morning. Dylan squeezed my hip, his fingers digging into the emerald silk of my dress. To any observer, it was a possessive, romantic gesture of a man obsessed with his fiancée. To me, it was a grounding reminder of the stakes. I was a bird in a cage, and Dylan was the only one who held the key. The room felt like it was closing in, the chatter of the elite sounding like white noise. I focused on the weight of the 5-carat diamond on my finger, a rock that felt like a shackle. Every time I caught my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. She looked polished, untouchable, and loved. But inside, I was counting down the seconds until I could escape the spotlight. Dylan moved us through the crowd with the grace of a predator, his hand never leaving my body. He played the part of the smitten lover with terrifying ease, leaning in to laugh at my fake jokes and brushing stray hairs from my face. "You're doing perfectly," he murmured under his breath as we navigated toward the buffet. "Only 3 more hours. You can survive 3 hours, can't you?" I nodded, but my throat felt tight. I wasn't sure if it was the lie that was suffocating me, or the way Dylan's touch made me want to forget that this was all a game. The gala roared around us like a storm, a sea of faces I was supposed to know but couldn't remember. I was trapped in the vacuum of Dylan's presence, an orbit I couldn't break even if I wanted to. We had signed the papers exactly 21 days ago in a windowless, sterile office on the 50th floor of his headquarters. $5 million for 6 months of my life. The math was simple, even if the reality was complex. I needed that money to pay off the predatory debts my brother had accrued in a series of failed gambles, and Dylan needed a respectable, wholesome fiancé to clean up his cold, ruthless image before a major international merger. It was supposed to be clinical. It was supposed to be a series of public appearances, a few staged photos, and a quiet, amicable breakup in the spring. But standing here, with the heat of his breath on my neck and the weight of his gaze on my lips, nothing felt clinical anymore. "You're doing great," he murmured, his voice cutting through my spiraling thoughts as he led me toward the darkened balcony. The cool Maine night air hit us like a physical shock, and I finally let out a long, ragged breath I'd been holding since we stepped out of the limousine. "I hate this, Dylan," I snapped, pulling away from him the moment we were safely obscured by the shadows of the stone pillars. I rubbed my arms, feeling the sudden chill. "I hate the lying. I hate the way Victor looks at me like I'm a puzzle he's about to solve, piece by agonizing piece. I feel like a fraud." Dylan didn't look at the glittering city skyline or the harbor below. He looked only at me. His eyes were dark, unreadable pools that seemed to swallow the moonlight. He stepped back into my personal space, his height overshadowing me and pinning me against the railing. "Victor isn't the problem, Abigail," he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming something intimate and dangerous. "The problem is you. You're starting to look at me like you actually care, and that wasn't in the contract." I felt a flush creep up my neck that had nothing to do with the cold. He was right. I was failing the first rule of the deal: don't get attached. Every time he defended me in front of his board, every time he checked to see if I had eaten during a long event, a small part of my heart betrayed me. "I'm a good actress," I whispered, though my voice wavered. "I'm just playing the part you paid for." Dylan reached out, his thumb grazing my lower lip, a gesture so tender it hurt. "Is that what this is?" "Just a performance." He stepped even closer until our chests were almost touching. I could smell the faint scent of mint on his breath. For a second, I thought he was going to break the rules right there on the balcony. I wanted him to. I wanted the lie to become the truth just for a moment so I wouldn't feel so alone in this golden cage. But he pulled his hand back, his face hardening into that familiar professional mask. "Get it together. We have more hands to shake." Just as the silence between us became a living thing, thick and heavy with unspoken words, the balcony door creaked open. I expected a waiter with a tray of appetizers, but instead, the light from the ballroom spilled out to reveal Sarah, Dylan's ex-wife. She was the woman who had nearly ruined his reputation 2 years ago with a scandalous divorce, the one who knew exactly how cold and calculating Dylan could truly be when the cameras weren't rolling. She was dressed in a gown that cost more than my father's house, and she looked at our joined hands with a sneer that made my blood run cold. "A fiancé, Dylan? Really?" She laughed, the sound sharp and hollow, like broken glass on a marble floor. "We both know you don't do forever. You don't even do next week. How much are you paying this one to stay in your bed and pretend you have a soul?" I felt Dylan's entire body go rigid beside me. The warmth I'd felt earlier evaporated instantly, replaced by a terrifying, icy stillness that seemed to lower the temperature of the balcony by 10 degrees. He didn't snap at her. He didn't lose his cool or raise his voice. That wasn't Dylan's way. Instead, he pulled me flush against his chest, his arm wrapping around my waist with a finality that took my breath away. His hand slid up to cup my jaw, forcing me to look at him, but his gaze remained fixed on Sarah with utter, lethal boredom. "Abigail isn't staying anywhere, Sarah. She's home, something you never quite managed to be." The insult was subtle but deep, and I saw Sarah's eyes flash with genuine rage. "Don't play house with me, Dylan," she spat, stepping closer into the shadows. "I know the terms of your merger. I know you need a wife by the end of the quarter. I'll find the paperwork. I'll find out who she really is." Before she could say another word, Dylan leaned down and kissed me. This wasn't the chaste, polite kiss we'd practiced in the back of the car. It was a deep, hungry, and possessive claim. His tongue swiped against mine, demanding a response, and despite the audience, I gave it to him. I reached up, my fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. It was a performance for Sarah, a way to shut her up and prove our love, but my heart didn't care about the script anymore. It started beating a frantic, wild rhythm against my ribs, a rhythm I didn't recognize but was terrified to lose. When he finally pulled back, Sarah was gone, the balcony door swinging shut behind her. Dylan looked down at me, his eyes dark with a hunger that wasn't faked. "Just keep pretending," he whispered, but his thumb lingered on my cheek, and for the first time, I wondered who he was really trying to convince. After the gala ended, the drive back to his penthouse was conducted in a suffocating silence. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows of the Maybach, but neither of us spoke. The kiss on the balcony hung in the air between us like an unexploded bomb. When we reached the penthouse, I went straight toward my guest room, desperate for the sanctuary of a door I could lock. But as I reached the handle, the door wouldn't close. Dylan was there, leaning against the frame, his tie loosened and hanging around his neck, his eyes searching mine with a renewed intensity. "Sarah is going to dig Abigail," he said, his voice rough and tired. "She's like a dog with a bone. She's going to talk to her contacts in the press. She's going to look into your family's finances. We have to move up the timeline. We need to be seen together more. Everywhere. All the time. Total immersion." "I can't do this 24 hours a day, Dylan," I whispered, finally sinking onto the edge of the large guest bed. My feet ached from the heels, but my heart ached more. I'm losing track of what's real and what's for show. I wake up in the morning and I have to remind myself that this ring is a prop. He walked into the room, the space suddenly feeling far too small for the two of us. He knelt on the floor between my knees, taking my trembling hands in his. His palms were warm, firm, and calloused, the hands of a man who had built an empire from nothing. "None of this is real, Abigail. The dress, the ring, the gala, it's all theater. It's a stage we're standing on to protect your father and my company. But the danger, the threat from Sarah and Victor, that's very real." He looked up at me, and for a split second the billionaire mask slipped. I saw a flash of raw loneliness in his eyes that mirrored my own, a vulnerability he never showed the world. "Don't break character now. I need you. I can't do this without you." I looked down at him, my heart breaking for the man underneath the money. He looked so human in that moment, stripped of his armor. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I traced the line of his jaw. "Why me, Dylan? You could have hired anyone, a professional actress, someone who wouldn't get emotional." He closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into my touch. "Because you were the only one who looked at me like I was a person, not a paycheck," he admitted softly. "Even when you hated me for the contract, you were honest. I can't find honesty anywhere else." We stayed like that for a long time, frozen in a moment that wasn't part of the deal. The city hummed outside the glass walls, but inside this room, the walls were closing in, forcing us closer together than the contract ever demanded. I knew then that the next few months weren't just going to be a test of my acting, they were going to be a test of my survival. The increased visibility campaign Dylan insisted on meant a mandatory trip to his sprawling mountain estate in the Rockies for a high-profile weekend retreat with potential investors. It was beautiful, a cathedral of glass and timber perched on the edge of a cliff. But as luck, or Dylan's meticulous planning, would have it, the guest wing was unexpectedly under renovation due to a burst pipe. I found myself standing in the middle of a master suite that featured a fireplace, a view of the snow-capped peaks, and one massive, sprawling, king-sized bed. I turned to him, my hands on my hips. "You've got to be kidding me, Dylan," I said, looking at the plush pillows and the single duvet. "The oldest trope in the book, a burst pipe and only one bed. Really?" He didn't laugh, and he didn't apologize. He simply began unbuttoning his coat, looking out at the heavy snow starting to fall outside. "The staff here are the biggest gossips in the county, Abigail. They talk to the tabloids for extra cash. If we aren't sharing a bed, the engagement is a front-page headline by tomorrow morning. I'm not risking the merger because you're uncomfortable with a piece of furniture." That night, we lay in the dark, a vast expanse of expensive, high-thread count sheets between us. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic crackle and pop of the fireplace in the corner. I could hear his breathing, slow, steady, and grounding. It was a strange intimacy, lying in the dark with a stranger who knew the deepest secrets of my family's ruin. "Dylan," I whispered into the shadows, "do you ever wonder what would happen if we just stopped, if we told the truth and let the chips fall where they may?" He didn't move for a long time, and I thought he had fallen asleep. Then his voice came through the dark, low and heavy with a strange kind of grief. "If we stop, we lose everything. I lose the company I built to spite my father, and you lose the home your family has owned for generations. In this world, Abigail, the truth doesn't set you free. It just gives your enemies more ammunition. I've spent my whole life making sure I never lose, and I'm not starting now." I turned on my side, looking at the silhouette of his back. He seemed so solitary, even with me lying right there. "Is that all life is to you? Winning and losing?" He finally turned to face me, the orange glow from the fire reflecting in his eyes. "Until I met you, yes. Now I'm not so sure." He reached across the gap, his hand finding mine under the covers. He didn't pull me closer, but he didn't let go either. We fell asleep like that, tethered together by a lie that was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from the truth. The mountain retreat was a nightmare of social chess, far worse than the gala. Every meal was an interrogation disguised as small talk. Sarah had somehow managed to get herself invited, and she spent the weekend hovering in corners, whispering to investors and trying to trip me up on the details of our romance. She asked about our first date, our favorite shared memories, the moment we knew we were the one. By the second night, I was physically and emotionally exhausted from the constant performance. I retreated to our room early, but Dylan followed me in, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. His face was a mask of cold fury. "You were distracted at dinner, Abigail," he hissed, packing the length of the room. "Victor was asking about our first trip together and you stumbled. You looked guilty." "Maybe because there wasn't a first trip," I yelled back, the frustration finally boiling over like a pot left on the stove too long. I threw my wrap onto the chair and turned to face him, my eyes stinging with tears. "There was a contract and a bank transfer. I'm tired of being a pawn in your corporate games, Dylan. I'm a human being, not an asset you can manage. I can't keep track of the lies anymore because they're starting to hurt." I turned to walk away toward the bathroom, needing to wash the fake smile off my face, but he grabbed my arm, spinning me back toward him. The anger in his eyes was eclipsed by something else, something raw, desperate, and entirely unscripted. "You aren't a pawn," he growled, his voice cracking for the first time. "You're the only thing keeping me sane in this hellhole. Do you think I like this? Do you think I enjoy lying to the world? I do it because it's the only way I know how to protect what matters." He pulled me into him, his grip tight and frantic. This time there were no cameras hidden in the bushes, no Sarah listening at the door, no Victor watching from across the table. It was just the two of us, stripped of our titles and our bank accounts. The tension that had been building for weeks, the shared looks, the accidental touches, the whispered secrets finally snapped. He looked at me with a hunger that was terrifying in its honesty. "Abigail, I can't keep pretending," he whispered. And then he leaned in, his mouth finding mine with a desperation that told me the game was officially over. Our lips met with the force of a head-on collision, a desperate release of weeks of pent-up energy and the suffocating fear that we were both falling for a lie we had created. This wasn't a fake kiss for an audience. There was no one to impress, no one to fool. It was raw, honest, and utterly terrifying. We moved toward the large bed, the pretense of the engagement finally stripped away like old wallpaper. That night, we made love with a quiet, fierce intensity that changed the gravity of my world. Every touch was a confession of things we weren't allowed to say. Every gasp was a revelation of a connection that defied the contract. In the dark, under the weight of his body and the heat of his skin, I realized that the $5 million contract was a cruel joke. I didn't want the money anymore. I didn't care about the estate. I just wanted the man who whispered my name in the dark as if it were a prayer for salvation. He was different in the dark, softer, more attentive, as if he were trying to memorize every inch of me with his fingertips. "Abigail," he murmured against my skin, his breath hitching. "I never intended for this to happen. I thought I could keep it professional. I thought I was stronger than this." I pulled him closer, my heart overflowing with a bittersweet ache. "We're just human, Dylan. You can't contract away feelings." As I lay in his arms afterward, watching the dying embers of the fireplace cast long, flickering shadows across the ceiling, I felt a terrifying sense of peace. I was in love with my employer. I was in love with a man whose entire life was built on a foundation of secrets and corporate warfare. Dylan held me tight, his heart beating a steady, heavy rhythm against my back. "Abigail," he whispered into the crook of my neck, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry." I didn't ask what he was sorry for. I was too afraid that the answer would shatter the fragile happiness I had finally found in his arms. The morning light began to creep across the floor, cold and gray, and I felt the reality of our situation returning. We were still in the middle of a merger. Sarah was still looking for the contract. Victor was still waiting for us to fail. But for those few hours in the dark, we were just Dylan and Abigail, two people who had found something real in a world of artifice. I watched him sleep for a moment, the harsh lines of his face softened by rest. He looked younger, less burdened. I knew that when he woke up, the mask would have to go back on. We would have to go downstairs and pretend to be the perfect, happy couple again. But I knew the truth now. I knew the man behind the money, and that knowledge felt like both a gift and a curse. I woke up a few hours later to an empty bed and the chilling sound of a ringing phone. The room was freezing, the fire having long since gone out. I picked up my phone to find a dozen missed calls from my father. When I finally answered, he was sobbing so hard I could barely understand him. "Abigail, the papers. They have everything, the morning news. It's all out. The contract, the bank statements, the emails between you and Dylan's lawyers. Dylan." He leaked it himself. He gave them the files. My world tilted on its axis, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I threw on a robe and ran into the living area of the suite to find Dylan sitting at the dining table, his laptop open, a cup of black coffee steaming beside him. He didn't even look up when I entered. His face was back to that cold, impenetrable stone. "It had to be done," he said, his voice as clinical and detached as the day we first met. "Sarah was going to leak a much worse, twisted version today. By leaking the raw contract myself, I control the narrative. I've already settled your father's debts in full. The contract is void. You're free to go, Abigail. The game is finished." "Free to go," I echoed, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. The pain in my chest felt like a physical wound, a jagged tear in my soul. "Last night. Was that part of the narrative too, Dylan? Was that just to make sure I was compliant? Was that just to ensure I wouldn't fight you or make a scene when the news broke this morning? He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were like shards of glass, clear, sharp, and utterly devoid of the warmth I had felt just hours ago. It was a complication, Abigail, one that we both participated in. My driver is waiting downstairs to take you back to the city. I suggest you take your things and leave before the paparazzi find the service entrance. I stood there, trembling with a mix of rage and heartbreak. I wanted to scream, to throw the coffee in his face, to demand the man from last night back. But he was gone. The Dylan who whispered my name in the dark had been replaced by the CEO who managed crises with a surgical precision. He had used me, protected me, and discarded me all in the span of 12 hours. I realized then that I had been playing a game with a grandmaster, and while my family was saved, I had lost the only thing that mattered to me. I gathered my things in a blur of tears, not looking back as I walked out of the suite. The golden cage was open, but as I stepped into the elevator, I felt like I was falling into a void. He had won the merger, he had saved my home, and he had destroyed me in the process. I spent the next week in my small, cramped apartment in the city, staring at the walls and ignoring the world. The news was an endless cycle of scandal. The Billionaire's $5 million fake. I was a punchline to the late-night hosts and a cautionary tale to the tabloids. I was a joke to the world, but I was a ghost to myself. I had the money to save my father, but I had no desire to live in the home it bought. Then, a courier arrived at my door with a package that required a signature. It wasn't a check or a legal document. Inside was a small, worn, leather-bound notebook, Dylan's private journal. I opened it with shaking hands, flipping to the very last page, dated the night he had sent me away. I had to let her go. If she stays with me now, the scandal and the investigation into my company will destroy her reputation and her future. I'll take the heat. I'll be the villain the world wants me to be. As long as she's safe and her father's home is secure, I've won the only game that ever mattered. I love her too much to let her be a part of my wreckage. The breath left my lungs in a sob. He hadn't betrayed me to save his merger or his ego. He had betrayed the relationship to save me from the fallout of his own life. He had made himself the monster so I could be the victim. He had sacrificed the only happiness he'd ever known to ensure I was protected. I realized then that I couldn't let him do it alone. I couldn't let him be the villain in a story where he was actually the hero. I threw on a coat and raced to his office building, pushing past the security guards and the throng of reporters camped out front. I burst into his office to find him standing by the window, looking out at the city he had conquered. He looked older, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. "You shouldn't be here, Abigail," he said, his voice breaking as he saw me. "The press is downstairs. If you're seen with me, the victim narrative is ruined. You'll lose everything." I walked straight up to him, ignored the warnings, and grabbed his hand, interlacing my fingers with his. "I don't care about the narrative, Dylan, and I don't care about being a victim." I looked him in the eye, seeing the man I had fallen for in the mountains. "You spent your whole life making sure you never lose. Well, I'm not letting you lose me. If the world wants a scandal, let's give them something real to talk about." For the first time in a week, a genuine, tired smile touched his lips. He pulled me into his arms, hiding his face in my neck. "I'm a mess, Abigail. My company is under fire. My reputation is in the gutter." I squeezed him tighter. "Then we'll be a mess together. No more contracts, no more lies." We walked out of that building together, hand in hand, facing the wall of flashing cameras and screaming reporters. We didn't offer a statement or a staged photo. We didn't have a PR strategy or a scripted response. We were just two people who had survived the lie and found something worth keeping in the ruins. The scandal was louder than ever, the headlines even more vicious, but as we reached the car, Dylan leaned in, just like he had that first night at the gala. This time there was no sweat on my back, no fear in my heart, no Victor or Sarah looming in the shadows. He leaned in, his lips brushing my ear, and whispered the only words that mattered. "No more pretending." We didn't go back to the penthouse with its glass walls and sterile beauty. We went back to the mountains, back to the cabin, and the one bed where the truth had first emerged from the darkness. We didn't need the $5 million or the corporate merger. We needed the messy, complicated honesty of the life we were finally allowed to build. Dylan looked at me as the sun rose over the jagged peaks, his hand firmly in mine, the diamond ring still on my finger. But this time, it was a symbol, not a shackle. "I've spent my entire life winning," he said softly, his voice clear and steady. "But losing that contract was the smartest move I ever made. It gave me you." I smiled, leaning my head on his shoulder as we watched the light turn the snow to gold. The fake engagement was over, buried under the weight of the truth, but the real story was just beginning. It wouldn't be easy. The legal battles and the public scrutiny would last for months. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't performing for an audience. I wasn't a bird in a cage or a pawn on a board. I was a woman loved by a man who had finally learned that some things are more important than winning. And as he pulled me into a kiss that tasted of pine and promises, I knew that the real story was infinitely better than the one we had practiced. We were no longer pretending. We were finally home.